Today, I'm going to explain video frame rate and slow motion in a way I guarantee you're going to understand. This video applies to GoPro frame rates and GoPro slow motion, but it also applies to all video frame rate and slow motion. So really, this video is video frame rate and slow motion explained. And it's the basics. So if you already understand frame rate and you're looking for a more advanced course, that'll come later. For today, I'm trying to get you to understand how it works, why to shoot in which frame rate, and how to do slow motion with your GoPro or any video camera. Also, like, comment, and subscribe below if this video is helpful for you. I need to grab two things from the grocery store that's gonna help me explain this concept. Trust me. All right, got the things I needed from the grocery store. They're gonna help me explain frame rates. And these are like my two favorite candies, so afterwards I get candy. I'm gonna save these for later. I get this question constantly. Someone gets a new GoPro or a big camera like a DSLR or even your iPhone, and you're asked what frame rate do you want to shoot in? And your options are usually something like 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second, and sometimes on some cameras, 240 frames per second. These options are going to be based on your camera. So if you look at your camera and you realize it doesn't have some of those options, it's just because of your camera, not because they don't exist. You'll also notice that as you increase resolution, your camera loses some of those options. So maybe in 1080, your camera can shoot at 120 or 240 frames per second, but at 4K, it can only do 60 or maybe 30 frames per second. Keep that in mind as we go through this. All right, with frame rates, we're gonna go over the what, the how, and the why. First, let's look at what frame rate is. In the most simple and obvious terms, at 24 frames per second, your camera is actually capturing 24 individual images every second of footage that you record. And at 30 frames per second, it's 30 images. At 60, it's 60 images. At 120 and 240, it's those images per second. Imagine a world where there was a Polaroid camera that could take 24 images per second. If you then took those 24 Polaroids and stacked them on top of each other and flipped them like a flip book, it would look like 1 second of video. Today, those frames that your camera is capturing are going to be represented by Skittles. 1, 2, 13, 14, 1, 2, 3. All right, so in video terms, for 1 second of footage shot at 24 frames per second, your camera has captured 24 individual frames that are represented by these Skittles. Not this one, this one's just for me. Huh. If I was shooting in 30 frames per second, I would have captured 6 more frames of footage. So now for that same 1 second, in 24 frames a second, I got 24 Skittles. In 30 frames per second, I got 30 Skittles. If this was 60 frames, I would have had 60 Skittles, and so on. But it all represents 1 second of actual footage that I captured with my camera. So now I've captured these frames, where do I put them? And that's where our editing software comes in. When choosing a frame rate, you actually want to know what frame rate you're going to edit in first. For now, I'm going to put these Skittles over there. When you open up Premiere, it asks you what frame rate you want your sequence to be. And if you choose a 24 frame per second timeline within Premiere, or whatever editing software you're using, you can imagine that for every 1 second that's on your timeline, there's 24 individual slots to put frames. These lifesavers will be our slots. I forgot that lifesavers are individually wrapped. Probably should have chosen a different candy. One for me. They're delicious. These are our slots on our timeline. They're imaginary. You can't see them within Premiere. just imagine that they're there. So because there's 30 lifesavers or slots, this is a 30 frame per second timeline. If this was a 24 frame per second timeline, it would have 24 slots. But because 30 frames makes math easier, we're gonna do a 30 frame per second timeline as the example. Get our Skittles back in line. So the Skittles represent our footage that we shot with our camera, and the lifesavers represent these slots on the timeline within Premiere Pro or Final Cut or whatever software you're editing within. So again, this is if you had your GoPro or other camera in 30 frames per second. So with 30 frames per second footage and a 30 frame per second timeline, it works perfectly. We have 1 frame per slot on our timeline. This is 1-to-1 footage to timeline speed. So this will just look like 30 frame per second video. Okay, now let's look at the same 30 frame per second timeline, but this time our footage is 60 frames per second. So for that same 1 second of footage captured, we now have 60 frames or Skittles. 1, 2, 3. So for that same 1 second of footage captured at 30 frames per second, I'd have 30 Skittles. But if I shot the same 1 second at 60 frames per second, I now have 60 Skittles. And on a 30 frame per second timeline, I've only got 30 slots. So you have 2 options of what to do. To make this 60 frame per second footage fit this 30 frame per second timeline, I can either drop 1 out of every 2 frames. And we're legit just gonna get rid of them. We don't use them at all. And now look at that. Now I have 30 frames for 30 slots. And when you play that back, it'll be 1-to-1 speed, just like when we had 30 frames and 30 slots for our 30 frame per second footage. So you can take higher resolution footage and just drop frames and it'll still fit to a lower frame per second timeline. But there's another option, and here's where slow motion comes in. Instead of dropping any frames, I'm gonna take the first 30 frames and put them in the first second. I can take the remaining 30 frames that I have from my 60-second footage and I can put them into the next second. So 1 second of footage filmed at 60 frames per second can fill 2 seconds on my 30 frame per second timeline, which results in a 2 times slow motion effect. So if you filmed for 5 seconds in 60 frames per second, you could put it onto a 30 frame per second timeline and that would be 10 seconds. Like I said, just 2 times slow motion. You have twice as many frames as there are slots. So you can either drop a frame every other frame or just extend your footage out. And the same is true for 120 frames per second. If you shoot in 120 frames per second, you'll have 120 Skittles piled up here. And when you look at a 30 frame per second timeline, you can either drop 3 out of every 4 Skittles. Don't do that though, it looks super wonky. Or you take that 120 frame per second footage and you can stretch it out for a 4 times slow motion effect because you have enough Skittles to fill 4 seconds of lifesavers. So that 1 second of footage now is slow motion. And finally, if your camera can do 240 frames per second, you would have 240 Skittles sitting here from every second of footage, which means you could fill 8 seconds of lifesavers. For super slow motion. This also explains why if you shoot something at 30 frames per second, so you only have 1 Skittle per lifesaver, you really can't do slow motion. Because trying to do slow motion would mean taking 30 Skittles and trying to fit them in 60 lifesavers. And what that looks like is this right here. With only 30 Skittles, you'd have to put a Skittle in every other slot to extend out to fill those 60 lifesavers. And then what your editing software does is basically holds on this Skittle for 2 frames, then it jumps to the next Skittle for 2 frames, jumps, 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 jumps. That's why it looks jittery. So if you know you're gonna shoot slow motion, shoot at 60 frames or higher to extend it on a 30 frame per second timeline so that you have enough Skittles for all your lifesavers. I love this analogy. This makes sense. When I see it like this, when I see something laid out visually, it makes way more sense than when someone just tries to talk me through it. I hope this makes sense for you also. We're not done yet, but comment your favorite Skittle color below. I'm interested. Mine used to be red, but now I think it's orange or green. I'm not sure. I'll eat this whole bag and let you know. Ooh, orange is good. And all of this math wizardry is equally true if your timeline is 24 frames per second. So if your timeline is 24 frames per second, you have 24 slots. So if you have 30 Skittles, then 30 frames per second is going to fill every slot plus 6 Skittles or frames. And your editing software is just gonna drop them. It doesn't drop the last 6 or the first 6. It drops one every 5th? 6, 35. One every 5 frames, it drops 1 frame so that your 30 frames per second footage fits on 24 frames and the extra Skittles get eaten by your software. This is the best idea I've had in forever. We get to eat so many Skittles. I bit my cheek. And on the same 24 frames per second timeline, if I was shooting at 60 frames per second, or 60 Skittles, I could slow that down 2 times, and then we would drop 12 frames, or Skittles. Because I shot 60 frames per second, but I only have 48 lifesavers, so only 48 slots. 60 minus 48, 12. Yeah, that's right. I was questioning my math there for a second. Apparently I'm a genius. And then 120 frames per second footage can be slowed down 5 times to fit on a 24 frames per second timeline. And 240 frames per second footage can be slowed down 10 times and fit on a 24 frames per second timeline and be 10 times slow motion. That's very slow. Imagine if you watch this whole video in 10 times slow motion, how long it would take you to watch it. Oh no, another Skittle down. Come back, little buddy. So with all of that said, why not just shoot in 120 frames per second and you could always drop frames later and make it real time, or you can extend it out and make it slow motion. The reason is, it looks super wonky. So imagine the same footage that's shot at 120 frames per second, we're gonna try to just drop frames and fit it onto our 30 frames per second timeline. That would mean we would need to drop 3 out of every 4 frames. So going this way, for these first 4 frames, we would drop 3 of them. Then the next 4 frames, we would drop 3 of them. And then 3 of them, and then 3. And what we would end up with is jumpy footage. And at 120 frames per second, because we're dropping so many frames, you're literally jumping from one moment in time to the next moment in time, even though on the timeline you've only gone 1 frame. And that's why you get that really jittery motion. You're literally going from one moment in time to a different moment in time and just skip in the middle. So this is all the what and the how footage and timelines work together. But why? Why shoot in 24 frames per second? Why shoot in 30? Why 60, 120, 240? Why? And the main thing it comes down to is preference. And that preference is mostly in motion blur. 24 frames per second is really similar to the motion blur that your eye naturally sees. Now your eye can see at way higher frame rates technically, but the motion blur that your eye naturally sees is most similar to footage shot at 24 frames per second. Like in my photography video where I explained aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, take your hand and put it in front of your face about a foot or 2 and wave it back and forth. See? It's blurry. It's blurry in front of me and it's blurry on my screen. Really similar motion blurs. If I was to crank my camera up to 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second and I did the same thing, the blur I saw in front of me would be way blurrier than what I was seeing on my monitor. At 30 frames per second, there's less blur. At 60 frames per second, there's much less blur. And beyond 60 frames per second, it's kind of hard to tell the difference between 60 and 120 and 240 if you play in real time. They all kind of look the same. 120 and 240 are for sure meant for slow motion and doing this stuff. Now I can't actually show you the difference between 24 and 30 and 60 in this video because this video is being edited on a 24 frames per second timeline. So this video is gonna have really natural looking motion blur. If I move around, it's kind of what you would see in real life. Maybe even a touch more motion blur at 24 frames per second than what you see. The best way to actually see is take your camera, set it to 24 frames per second on a tripod, get in front of it, do a little movement, do a little dance, then set it to 30 frames per second, then set it to 60, 120, 240, and look at the footage before you drop it into a sequence on your timeline. Because if you drop it into a sequence, it's gonna default to whatever the timeline is. Make sure you're actually previewing the file and you're not dropping it in to your sequence before you look at the difference. But you'll see the difference. At 24 frames per second, there's way more blur. At 30 frames, 60, 120, there's way less blur, if any at all. To give you examples you can relate to though, most movies are shot at 24 frames per second. Most sitcoms at 30 frames per second. Most news shows and sports are shot at 60 frames per second. So the reason that the NFL looks so hyper realistic is because it is hyper realistic. It's more real or more smooth than what your eye would normally see. If you were down on the field and a guy went running past you, it would look kind of like a blur. But on TV, it's this smooth, beautiful shot of this guy in crystal clear, super sharp 4K. Yeah, that's not what your eye normally sees. So what's the best? It's totally up to you. I really like 24 frames per second because it looks really good, it's really pleasing to the eye. But if you're doing a documentary on sports or you're doing the news, you want to be at 30 frames or 60 frames per second to give you that feel. So imagine frames per second as being another tool in your arsenal to give a certain look to your viewer. The key thing to remember in all of this is know what your timeline is going to be before you go out and shoot. Because if your timeline is going to be 30 frames per second and you've gone out and you've shot 24 frames per second footage, you're going to lay it all in there and there's going to be 6 empty slots. It's going to skip frames to fit 24 frames per second footage onto a 30 frame per second timeline. So know what your timeline is going to be before you go out and film. That way, when you're out shooting and you know this is going to be a real-time clip, you can shoot at 24 frames per second. But if you know you want slow-mo, you can jump to 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second. But knowing what you're going to edit first is going to help you decide what frame rate to shoot while you're on your shoot. How many times have I said shoot? A lot. Let me know if the whole Skittles Lifesavers thing made sense to explain footage versus timeline, frames per second, how it all works together. If it did make sense, or you just liked this video, hit the like button below. It helps a ton. Also make sure to subscribe for more videos like this, and comment below and let me know what your favorite Skittles color is. I think I'm leaning towards orange right now. Orange is really good. All the oranges. So good.